Okay, folks, here we are. We have this scheduled. This is a commentary on when the Messiah was born. And I thought that I would put this together for people and do a reading and commentary on it. This was given to me by a brother in the Messiah who happens to run a church. And I thought it would be a good idea to go through it and just read it and see what you guys think about it. But it has to do with the timing of the Messiah's birth. Now, basically, uh, this is taken from a Bible. It's a Bible that is part of Perry Stone ministry. I've always respected Perry Stone because he's a man of intense study. And so I thought this would be very interesting to go through because there will probably be a lot of historical elements here. So what I'm going to do is just read through this and make commentary where I see necessary. So the question is, when was Messiah born? And it goes on. For many years, many believers have understood that Messiah was most likely not born on December 25th, even though that is the traditional day many Christians celebrate his birth. So if not December 25th, when was Yeshua born? Actually, the time of his birth is not that difficult to calculate. He was likely born at the time of the high holy days between Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, and Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, it actually is Yom Teruah, not Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a civil holiday that the rabbis put into place. It has Babylonian connection, but Yom Teruah is the Feast of Trumpets. These feast days normally occur in the fall of the year, corresponding to the Gregorian calendar months of September or October. Well, that's about when Sukkot happens. Because the Hebrew calendar is lunar in nature, the time varies from year to year in relationship to the Gregorian calendar. Basically, remember, here he's talking about the lunar part. Now, the rabbinical calendar does have a lunar component to it, but the Essenes were using a solar calendar. So that's something to take note of. So the calculation of Messiah's birth begins with Luke's account of the birth of John the Baptist. His father Zacharias was the priest of the order of Abijah. As he performed his duties in the temple, an angel appeared to him, announcing that his wife Elizabeth would conceive, giving birth to a son who would be named John. Scripture and other Jewish writings help us closely estimate the time of year this event occurred. Yahweh revealed to David details concerning the temple, including how the priests were to be organized on 24 groups or courses. These 24 priestly families are recorded in 1 Chronicles 24, 7 through 18. The family of Abijah was the 8th course. According to the Jewish history, the first ministration cycle, let's see here. The first ministration cycle began on the first Sabbath of the Hebrew month. This would be in Aviv, which would be our March or April, which is the month that Yahweh said was to be a beginning of months for Israel. This actually is biblically the new year, the beginning of months. Remember that in our society, we have a Roman calendar, and it's very much different than what the calendar in the Bible is. Okay, so basically, each division of priests would minister in turn for 1 week, which means each priestly course ministered about twice a year. This cycle was suspended 3 times a year because all priests were required to be at the temple for the 3 pilgrimage festivals: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacle. So that's in Deuteronomy 16:16. This means that Zacharias and all the priests of the line of Abijah would have ministered in their courses for the first time during the Hebrew month Sivan. Now remember, this is the Sivan. All of these names for the Jewish months are borrowed from Babylon. And that happens around June. His second period of service would have fallen around the Hebrew month Kislev, 6 months later. Obviously, the Bible does not tell us which of these 2 times the angels appeared to Zacharias. However, if we presume it was on the first occasion, June, then some interesting possibilities begin to fall into place. When Zacharias finished his duties, unable to speak, that's in Luke 1:19 through 20, Zacharias would have returned to his home, and soon afterward, Elizabeth would have become pregnant. Assuming she conceived soon after his return from his priestly duties, John would have been conceived around the time of Shavuot or Pentecost. That the one who, with the baptism of water, would prepare the way for the one who would baptize with the Holy Ghost and with fire is compelling enough. Yet even more interesting is the fact that 40 weeks later brings us to the month of Aviv, the spring of the year, and very near the time of Passover. Now, Aviv just means literally when the barley it comes out. Literally, the Aviv is like the head of the barley. And so remember, they would have these guys that would go out and they would look around for when the barley would begin to sprout. And then these would be authorized people that the temple would entrust to give them a report as to when the Aviv, and then they would start the count of the new year. Now, it's interesting to consider that John may have been born on Passover and 8 days later would have been circumcised on the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Thus, the timing of John's birth would satisfy the Jewish expectations that Elijah would appear at the Passover festival. And that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because the Jews, they would leave an extra place setting for the Passover Seder for Elijah, because they look at Malachi chapter 4, and it says, that we are to wait for Elijah before the great and terrible day of Yahweh, and that he's going to turn the hearts of the children to the fathers and the hearts of the fathers to the children. And then it goes on, it says, lest I smite the earth with a curse. So it's interesting there that he would bring that up. Of course, Luke tells us that the angel announced John would indeed possess the spirit of Elijah and would prepare the way for the Lord. Later, Yeshua explained that John was Elijah. Well, he said that he was a type of Elijah. He implied that, but he did say, but I tell you, Elijah shall truly come. Further on, it says that, establishing the fact that John was a forerunner to announce the Messiah. He's got that right. If, in fact, John was born at the time Passover, then we can confidently conclude that Christ would have been born during the time of the fall festivals, most likely the Feast of Trumpets or the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, if I were to choose between the two, I would say it's Tabernacles, because Paul literally says, one of them says he tabernacled among us. Let's take a look at that really quick here. That's in, that's John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We looked upon his glory, the glory of the one and only from the Father, full of grace and truth. Okay. We can say this because Luke also records for us that when the angel Gabriel visited Mary and told her she would conceive and bear the promised Messiah, Elizabeth was already in her 6th month. If Elizabeth did in fact conceive in June, soon after Zachariah's temple duties were completed, then her 6th month of pregnancy would have been during the Hebrew month Kislev. It is in this month, the 25th of Kislev, to be precise, that the festival of Hanukkah begins. This brings up another interesting possibility. We presume that Mary conceived immediately after her angelic visitation and may have left soon after in order to celebrate Hanukkah in the Holy City. In addition to visiting her cousin Elizabeth, who lived just a few miles from Jerusalem, a journey for this purpose would not be far-fetched when we think of the fact that Yeshua later went to Jerusalem for the festival of Hanukkah. That's true. He did show up at the festival of Hanukkah, didn't he? In fact, it was at this festival that Messiah acknowledged he was the promised Messiah, and moreover reaffirmed his divine origin when he said, I and my Father are one. Now, we recently have had some people dispute this here, but it does affirm and clearly seems to indicate that there is a divine that Messiah is of the Father and that he is of the divine substance of the same. If Mary conceived during this time period, it became very possible, maybe even likely, that her conception occurred at Hanukkah, the festival of lights, in late December. The essence of the Hanukkah celebration is to commemorate that the house of Yahweh, once desecrated, was restored to purity and usefulness. Now, here's where Perry Stone might have a little bit of trouble. Yes, it's true that the Hasmonean period, which we read about in the book of Maccabees, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees. These are books that are retained in the Catholic Bible. You will not find them in the Protestant Bible. But they recount the horrific ordeal that the Jewish nation underwent when Antiochus Epiphanes, he was like a Greek Phoenician type guy, was trying to get everyone Hellenized, and he would make it illegal and unlawful for Jews to keep the Sabbath, to be circumcised, to wear tzitzit, and he forced many Jewish people to eat pork, which was considered an abomination, still is, by the way. And so basically, the period, the Hasmonean period, which is the period that we read about after the books Ezra and Nehemiah. From the period of Ezra and Nehemiah to the book of Matthew, there's a period of about 200, 300 years, somewhere in there. Basically, there was some things that happened that are not often talked about. One of them being that the sons of Zadok were defrocked from their temple position, and people who were not of the line of Zadok were installed in the high priest office. So when he says restored to purity and usefulness, that's somewhat, in some ways it is true, but it's not. It is a corrupted sense still. Mary was chosen to be the vessel of the Messiah throughout her humankind, through which humankind, polluted and desecrated by the fallen nature, would be restored through the purity of Messiah. How apropos it would be for the light of the world, the Messiah, to be conceived during the Jewish festival of lights. Now, if the theory I've written about above is correct, then presumably Mary stayed with Elizabeth until the birth of John at the time of Passover, exactly 14 weeks later, and then returned home at the end of her first trimester of pregnancy. Using the Hanukkah season as the marker for Christ's conception, 40 weeks later would mark the time of his birth in the fall months, September to October, at about the time of the High Holy Days. In my opinion, the birth would have taken place on trumpets or Sukkot. Well, it's interesting that he does acknowledge Sukkot. Considering some of the hints in the text, I tend to believe it was most likely Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, he's right about that. I believe, that's what I believe for a while now. Consider what John's gospel records for us. And the word was made flesh, dwelt among us. Now, that's in John 1:14. The Greek word dwelt is skinu, literally meaning to reside in a tent or tabernacles. Now look at that. I just read that John 14, didn't I? John 14 says, and the word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So that word tabernacle is skinu, and it means to reside in a tent. And you think about it, the Messiah was born of a virgin. The seed was the Holy Ghost implanted in Mary. And he took upon himself flesh, and we can think of flesh like a tent. Now, you add to this what Peter was saying when he talks about his body as a tent. This is in Peter 1:14. Okay, and here's what he says. This is Peter says, knowing that shortly I must put off this my tent or tabernacle, even as our master Yeshua Messiah hath showed me. So think about this, the very coming of Messiah, the flesh part was like his tent. And what did it house? The Ruach HaKodesh. It housed the very spirit of Elohim. So let's continue on here. When Yahweh gave Israel instructions pertaining to Mishkan or Moses' tabernacle, it was so he could dwell among them. He said, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell or tabernacle among them. Remember that we see all of these types and shadows where literally Yahweh in his presence is dwelling in these dwellings of sorts. Think of when Messiah said that, when he said, the Spirit of Yahweh is within you. Let me see if I can call that one up here. Yeah, that's right. The kingdom of God is with you, in you. Okay, so that is in, let's see here, Luke 17:20. Let's take a look at that. Okay, let's see here. Now, when he was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of Yahweh should come, he answered them, saying, "The kingdom of Yahweh does not come with observation, nor will they say, 'See here,' or 'See there.' For indeed the kingdom of Yahweh is within you." Think about that. So look at all of these elements coming together. You've got Yahweh and his Spirit at Mount Sinai dwelling in the tabernacle. In the most holies, he would come down and meet the high priest on Yom Kippur. Well, Yom Kippur, during the high priest would make intercession for the children of Israel, and they would slay a lamb, and then the scapegoat, that the high priest would put his hands on the scapegoat and commute all of the sins of the nation upon the scapegoat, and he would literally pronounce Le Azazel. And then a young man would take that goat out and push it over a cliff. It would go down and it would die. Okay, so the idea of the Spirit of Yahweh dwelling in in some kind of a structure, and with us, it's literally our body. Okay, so it was during the Feast of Tabernacles that Jews would build a simple shelter of wood and branches called a sukkah or booth. During the 7-day festivals, families and guests will eat meals and even sleep in the sukkah to remember the 40 days of wandering in the wilderness with Yahweh in their midst. In other words, the Feast of Tabernacles celebrates the fact that, in spite of the wilderness surroundings, the Creator was among them, Yahweh with us. Of course, this reminds us of Isaiah's prophecy concerning the coming Messiah. "Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." So far, I did get a chance to look at this briefly before I started this study, but I will say this. I got a sense that he was right on target with most of what he was presenting. Okay, so now consider also that even though Caesar Augustus had called for a census, that's Luke 2:1, meaning that Joseph and Mary had a journey to Bethlehem, the census was not necessarily the reason for the crowded conditions and lack of lodging. In fact, it is unlikely that so many people would have been in Bethlehem's inn simply to be counted in tax. It's more likely that Joseph combined the trip to Bethlehem to be registered with his spiritual obligation to go to Jerusalem for one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Bethlehem is within 5 miles of Jerusalem. In other words, the reason for the overcrowded inns may have been due to so many other pilgrims who journeyed to Jerusalem for the festival, most likely Tabernacles. Now, think about this. If you're a Roman administrator, what are you going to do? When's the best time to catch people for taxes? When they're already there, when they're already crowded. See, that's the point. Who's going to show up willingly to pay tax money? No, the tax collectors would show up while all the people were there already and collect money. And remember, those people had already brought money as part of their obligation for the temple service. So think about it. The Romans were pretty sly about things. It also makes sense that Joseph and Mary's journey had been timed to conclude before the beginning of the festival, seeing that the first day was a Sabbath. It would seem they found lodging just in time, and that point presents the strong possibility that Christ was born on a high Sabbath, the first day of Sukkot. Okay, now that's called a Shabbaton, a high Sabbath. That Joseph is forced to take the pregnant Mary to lodge outside does not necessarily mean they slept in a stable, barn, or cave. In fact, the scripture never makes that assertion, but simply says the baby was placed in a manger or feeding trough. For the record, the word for stable in Hebrew is sukkah. Look at that. Which in its plural form becomes Sukkot. See Genesis 33:17. Now, isn't that interesting? If Christ's birth occurred during Sukkot, it is possible, perhaps even probable, that the manger he was placed in was in close proximity to or even inside a sukkah. In fact, because meals were eaten inside the sukkah during the festival, food was typically stored in a stall or crib within the sukkah itself. The fact that he was placed in a feeding crib demonstrate that he is, as he said, the bread which came down from heaven. That's in John 6:41-51. Okay. The manna Israel ate in the wilderness served as a type of the bread that, when eaten, would grant eternal life. This bread's connection to the wanderings of the wilderness establishes yet another point to advance the notion Christ was born during the Feast of Tabernacles. Keep in mind that one of the primary goals of Sukkot is to remember that Israel once wandered through the wilderness and slept under the stars, all the time being cared for and protected by the Creator who dwelled among them. According to Luke, Yeshua was circumcised 8 days after his birth, but not in the temple as many suppose, because Mary remained ceremonially unclean for 40 days, according to Leviticus 12:2-8. So when a woman has a child, she is ceremonially unclean. Okay, so it's for 40 days after she has a child. In fact, Luke states clearly that they did not go to Jerusalem until after her days of purification were satisfied. See Luke 2:22. Okay. Had Jesus been born on the first day of Sukkot, the day of his circumcision would have been the 8th day of Sukkot, which, like the first day, is a Sabbath. Isn't that something, how he ties that together? So the birth of Messiah on the high Sabbath, that's the first day of Sukkot, and the circumcision of Messiah on a high Sabbath, which would be the 8th day. This day is referred to as Simchat Torah, or rejoicing in the Torah. It comes from Simcha. On this day, Jews complete their annual cycle of Torah readings, indicating that the reading of the Torah has been fulfilled. Consequently, on this day, the Torah scrolls is rolled back to the beginning, the book of Genesis, so the reading cycle may start all over again. If Yeshua was in fact circumcised on this day, it would indicate that he had come to fulfill the law and the prophets, as he, in fact, said he was sent to do. Interesting. It also indicates how humankind is to rejoice at his coming. The word of living Torah became flesh that he may dwell among us. Just 8 days earlier, the angels had proclaimed to the shepherds tending their flocks that something wonderful had happened. The shepherds, upon seeing the child, rejoiced and praised Yahweh for all the things that they had seen. So now we go to this next part. Can we be sure? Now, one of the most convincing points relevant to the time of the Messiah's birth is the death of Herod the Great, which most scholars believe occurred in 4 BC. According to the scripture, when the star appeared in the heavens, wise men, these were possibly rabbinic sages living in Babylon. I have a different view on that. I think that they were sages, true, but they were Parthian sages, and they were a part of the scattered house of Israel that had gone into Parthia. But however you want to interpret that, they traveled to Jerusalem seeking the one who was born King of the Jews. Matthew 2:2. Herod, a very wicked, diseased, and paranoid man, sent them to find the newborn king in Bethlehem, feigning a desire to worship him as well. Yeah, he was lying. He wanted to kill him. When the wise men found Joseph, Mary, and the child, the family had moved from the sukkah into a house. That's in Matthew 2:11. Most likely because she had just given birth and the outdoors would not have been considered an ideal place for a newborn infant. After being warned in the dream, the wise men did not return to Jerusalem, prompting Herod to dispatch men to murder all the male children who were 2 years of age and younger. However, Joseph had already been warned in a dream to take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. According to Matthew, they remained there until Herod was dead. That's Matthew 2:15. This prompts an interesting point. Luke said that Joseph and Mary appeared in Jerusalem to present the child unto Yahweh as the Torah commanded. So that's in Luke 2:22-24. According to the Torah, this would have taken place on the 40th day after the birth of the child. See Leviticus 12:2-4. This means that within 40 days of being born, the infant Messiah had been taken to Egypt and brought back again to Jerusalem. This fact, coupled with Matthew's description of their flight to Egypt, which lasted until Herod's death, means that Herod expired within a few weeks, perhaps just a matter of days after slaying the infants. Now, that was a horrible thing. Remember, Herod sent his soldiers to kill all the infants in Judea 2 years old or younger. Now, according to Flavius Josephus, Herod was stricken with a terrible and painful disease that intensified just after a lunar eclipse. The eclipse most scholars believe Josephus refers to occurred on March 4 BC, very near the time of Passover. Josephus says that Herod, constantly seeking treatment for his ailments, continued in agony and died sometime in the fall months of the same year, very close to the time I believe Messiah was born. This would support the scenario that Joseph fled with the child to Egypt very soon after his birth and remained there not longer than a few weeks. Now, some argue that the presentation of Messiah in the temple on his 40th day occurred long before Herod's death. The basis for this argument is twofold. Herod had children 2 years and younger murdered, and two, the Magi found Joseph, Mary, and the child in a house, not a stable. In regard to the question of why Herod murdered male children 2 years and younger, it is important to point out that Jews typically consider conception, not birth, to be the beginning of life. To those who believe life begins at birth, these murdered children would have been no older than 1 year. Also consider that when Joseph and family returned from Egypt, they did not go live in Bethlehem, but Nazareth, Matthew 2:23. Now, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because he's counting the 9 months of when a baby grows in a woman's womb. And then you add an extra year on that. That's where you get roughly a couple years. Now, that's an interesting point there, that Jews consider a child born at conception. All right, also consider that when Joseph and the family returned to Egypt, they did not go to live in Bethlehem, but Nazareth. That's Matthew 2:23. According to Luke's account, immediately after presenting the child in the temple, they went directly to Nazareth. We should also consider that upon seeing the child in the manger, the shepherds traveled the countryside and made widely known what they had seen. Bethlehem lies just 5 to 6 miles from the actual old city of Jerusalem, making it seem unlikely that 2 years could have passed before Herod heard anything about the birth of the child destined to be the king of the Jews. It would seem that the Magi appeared very near to the time of his birth, and by the time they arrived in Bethlehem, mother and child had been moved from the sukkah into the house. All things considered, my opinion is that a significant amount of evidence points to the probability that Messiah was born in the fall, most likely during the Feast of Tabernacles. Finally, I find it very interesting that the prophet Zechariah makes clear that in the millennial age, all nations will be compelled to go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and observe the Feast of Tabernacles. Interesting that a Protestant minister would recognize that, isn't it? That's in Zechariah 14:16-17. Might it be that all peoples will be required by law to honor the birthday of the King of Kings? If Messiah was born near the Feast of Tabernacles, this would place his conception around Hanukkah, which would fall in December. While many Western traditions have emerged concerning December 25th, I believe this date indicates the time of his conception and that the time of the Feast of Tabernacles was the time of his physical birth. Although 9 months prior at his conception, the time would fall at the end of December. Now, isn't that something? He's trying to... See, I don't know whether he's trying to legitimize by saying that Jews believe that a birth started at conception, and therefore he's trying to legitimize December 25th. But this is an interesting argument he's making here. Very interesting. Let's go on to the reason of the transfiguration of Messiah. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all relate this amazing event called the Transfiguration. All three mention that Messiah's garments were white and shining during this experience. That's in Mark 9:2 and Luke 9:29. And all three reveal that Messiah invited Peter, James, and John to pray with him on the mountain. That's in Mark 9:2 and Luke 9:28. These three Gospels also reveal that Moses and Elijah appeared to Messiah. Luke notes that all three disciples were sleeping at first, then awoke to see Messiah's glory and the two famous prophets of Israel. That would be Elijah and Moses. That's in Luke 9:32. All three writers refer to Peter's desire to build three tabernacles, actually booths. See Mark 9:5, Luke 9:33. All three record that a cloud overshadowed them and that Yahweh spoke from heaven, calling Messiah his beloved son. That's Luke 9:7 and Luke 9:35. Luke notes that the purpose of the visit was to converse with Messiah about his coming death. Luke 9:31. Messiah personally invited Peter, James, and John, often called his inner circle, to the mountain where they witnessed this event. Later, after Messiah's ascension, these men became the three main leaders in the church. The prophecies concerning the appearance of the Messiah were in the Torah and the prophets. Moses represented the Torah, whose rituals concealed Yahweh's plan for redemption, and Elijah represented the prophets who foresaw the Messiah and his king. Moses and Elijah discussed details concerning Messiah's death in Jerusalem. It is uncertain what parts of Yahweh's plan were unknown that these prophets revealed to Messiah, but there was a necessity for them to speak to him concerning the full revelation of his sufferings. Now, it's interesting how he postulates what a Moses and Elijah and Messiah in the transfigured state on the mountain may have been talking about. They're very interesting there. The cloud that overshadowed them was the glory of Elohim, the same cloud called the glory of the Lord that appeared in the tabernacle of Moses. That's Exodus 16:10 and 24:16. Now, this cloud was a visible manifestation of Yahweh's presence, and everyone on the mountain that day heard the voice of Yahweh within the cloud, saying, Messiah was his beloved son. Peter suggests building three booths or tabernacles, which can be connected to the idea that the resurrection of the righteous was believed to be linked with the Feast of Tabernacles. Ah, that's interesting. When the Jewish people build booths using the branches from 4 trees and live outside their homes in the booths for 7 days, some believe that after Peter awoke and saw Moses and Elijah, he believed the resurrection had just occurred. Devout Jews believed in Messiah's day and still believe today that Elijah's appearing would precede the coming of Messiah prior to the Messiah establishing his kingdom. Now, Malachi 4:5, I mentioned that. And Messiah seems to intimate that when he says, I tell you, and Elijah truly shall come. But he seems to suggest that John the Baptist was a type of Elijah. And yet, Messiah did not resurrect the dead as expected when his kingdom was fully manifested. Messiah referred to John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah as the prophet like unto Elijah, who had preceded him in the ministry. According to Malachi 4:5, Elijah the prophet will appear before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. That would be like the great day of judgment. That would be like the second half of the tribulation, I think. Elijah is also one of the 2 witnesses during the tribulation in Revelation 11:1-3. Now, we have often postulated just who was the second of these 2 witnesses in Revelation. Because I have often believed, and so has Brother James, that there will be another Elijah figure that will withstand the anti-Messiah in the Great Tribulation. Okay, so let's go now to Josephus, the eyewitness of the destruction of the temple. Within 1 generation, 40 years, the Messiah's prediction of Jerusalem's desolation, see Matthew 24:1-2, the Roman 10th Legion surrounded the sacred city, initiating an invasion to squelch a rebellion. Josephus, the well-known Jewish historian, lived during the time and wrote a detailed history under a section titled War of the Jews. According to Josephus, the Romans surrounded the city, preventing Jews from entering or exiting it, and internal famine became so bad that the mobs broke into homes searching for food. Anyone who looked physically fit was presumed to have food hidden, and their homes were ravaged and trashed. Anyone who looked sickly and thin was ignored. Any house that was closed up was considered to be concealing food. Home invaders would tear down the doors, snatch any food out of the mouths of those who had even small morsels. The elderly were beaten, women had their hair torn, and infants were held upside down and shaken to get bits of food from their mouths. Certain wealthy citizens would swallow gold coins in an attempt to hide their wealth and attempted to secretly leave the city through a sewage tunnel. An Israeli archaeologist excavated an area near the ancient pool of Siloam and discovered the sewer system from the Roman period. I was once permitted to walk more than 100 feet in this narrow tunnel. In certain areas above my head were broken rocks where Roman soldiers had broken through to catch the escapees and pull them out and rip their stomachs apart to find gold coins. Boy, imagine the horror of the War of the Jews. And one night, an estimated 2,000 Jews who deserted the city were slain and had their bellies ripped open apart as soldiers looked for gold coins that had been hidden by swallowing. Roman soldiers caught as many as 500 Jews per day, and many were crucified in public view on the walls of the city. The famine within Jerusalem became so intense that entire communities were affected. Dead bodies lay untouched in the streets, and the sight became unbearable. When the Roman general Titus saw the dead bodies and the putrefaction running about them, he gave a groan and, spreading out his hands to heaven, called God to witness that this was not his doing, and such was the sad case of the city itself. Oh, that's in Josephus' War of the Jews. And admittedly, it was a horrific, horrific time. So as Roman soldiers toppled the massive stones on Jerusalem's wall, breaking through the gates and amassing on the temple platform, Titus called 6 military commanders for advice on what to do with the temple. One person suggested demolishing the building, stating that as long as the temple remained, the Jews would be inspired to rebel against Rome, since the temple was a Jewish gathering place. Another suggested leaving the temple intact with the agreement that the Jews would lay down their arms and that if they took up weapons, again, the temple would be destroyed. Titus reasoned that the Romans should not avenge themselves with things, but with men. He said it would be a mischief to the Romans to burn down such an edifice and an ornament to their government if it were allowed to remain. The final decision was to take strong men and quench the fire burning on the Temple Mountain. Within a few days, however, a Roman soldier threw a burning torch into the gold window of the sacred holy temple, setting the interior building on fire. Later, as the stones cooled, soldiers observed that gold had melted and dripped over the large limestone blocks. The stones were toppled in order to peel the valuable gold from the surface. Remember when Messiah said, not one stone would be left upon another? When he prophesied that? That's how that came to pass. And not one stone would be left upon another because the Roman soldiers were looking for gold that had melted all over the stones. Thus the words of Yeshua were literally fulfilled. There shall not be left here one stone upon another, there shall not be thrown down. All right, so false prophets and sacred oracles. It is amazing to read how those who were considered wise interpreted the sacred oracles and other signs prior to the destruction of the temple. Josephus mentions that 4 years before the destruction, that's in AD 66, a star shaped like a sword appeared in the heavens, and a comet was seen over the city for an entire year. Joseph reported seeing a supernatural light shining around the temple altar and the holy house at the 9th hour of the night, lighting up the entire area as bright as daytime. The light lasted for 30 minutes, then faded. He then writes that the eastern gate of the inner court, which normally took more than 20 men to opened and closed of its own accord. Wow. At the Feast of Pentecost, the priests were going into the inner court of the temple when they felt a quaking, heard a great noise, and then heard the voice of a multitude saying, let us depart from hence. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if that would be like angels that were protecting that place. Could that be the voice of angels saying, let us depart from hence? Josephus observes that there were false prophets who were infatuated without either eyes to see or mind to consider, did not regard the denunciations that Yahweh had made against them. He also records that many among the Jews considered these strange cosmic and temple signs to be a witness of Yahweh's favor upon the Jews and his disfavor upon the Romans. So they had it totally turned around, didn't they? Totally turned around. Now, He also records that many among the Jews considered these strange cosmic temple signs to be the witness. Okay, so we already did that. These self-deceived men convinced people it was time to rebel against the Romans and that the Lord would be with them. The wiser men among them, however, knew that God had departed from the temple and the city would be destroyed. Now, isn't that something? After the initial invasion and burning of the temple platform, it was observed the temple platform area now lay in the shape of 4 square. According to one sacred oracle, it was written, "Then shall their city be taken and their holy house, when once their temples should become 4 square." At the destruction, Jerusalem lay in ruins. The city gates were burnt and the walls had been toppled as the holy temple was completely destroyed. The thousands of Jews had been slain and others were taken captive, and a few were fortunate enough to escape. The year AD 70 marked the end of the nation of Israel as the Jewish homeland, the city of Jerusalem as the Jewish capital, and Jewish control of the land. I'll come down to the end here. In the year AD 71, the Romans plowed over Jerusalem with salt, believing that the city would never be rebuilt. From that time onward, Jerusalem and Israel, renamed Palestine, would change hands from one empire to another until finally Israel restored and recognized as a nation in 1948. Wow, think about that. So now he has this part here, this last part here. How can the days be shortened in the tribulation? 24:22. Messiah's prophecy saying, "Except those days should be shortened," has puzzled scholars, since the numbers of days and years of the tribulation is already set for 7 years. That's in Daniel 9:27. The book of Revelation divides the 7 years into 2 halves. The first half is 42 months, and the second half, known as the Greater Tribulation, is also designated as 42 months. That's in Revelation 11:2 and 13:5. The time frame is so precise that John revealed the exact number of days for each half of the tribulation. The first half is 1,260 days, and the second phase is also 1,260 days, totaling a period of 7 years. The perplexing question has been, since the time of tribulation has already been set for 7 years, we know the exact number of days, then how could the days be shortened? Some scholars suggest that the actual days will not be shortened, but the persecution itself will be shortened. See the notes in Dake's Annotated Bible, New Testament Notes, page 27. There may be another possibility. The answer may be found when we compare the number of days of the Gregorian calendar to the days on the biblical prophetic calendar. In ancient history, the calendar consisted of 12 months of 30 days each. The Jews used a lunar calendar based on the cycles of the moon and added a month every 4 years to ensure that the 7 yearly festivals fell on their assigned seasons. Later, the entire world accepted a solar calendar consisting of 365.25 days, making a solar year, adding a leap year every 4 years to make an entire day out of 0.25, 1/4 part of the day in each year. When comparing a solar year with the numbers used in Revelation for the time of the tribulation, we discover something interesting. The first half of the tribulation is 42 months, consisting of 1,260 total days on the prophetic calendar. Today on our solar calendar, there are slightly over 1,277 days that make up 42 months. According to calculations of Revelation, the tribulation is 2 42-month periods of 1,260 days each, or a total of 2,520 days in 7 years. Today, using our solar calendar, there are actually 2,556.50 days in a 7-year period. The chart below explains this. Okay, so there's the prophetic calendar. All right, the solar calendar of today has 36.5 more days than the prophetic calendar. Yahweh will use during the tribulation. Thus, the tribulation will consist of 2 periods of 42 months. But these are 42 months on Yahweh's prophetic time calendar, and not the Gregorian calendar used today. There is an additional 36.5 days on the Gregorian calendar that are not on Yahweh's prophetic calendar. Thus, the tribulation is 7 years, but about 36 days shorter in Yahweh's view than on the world's solar calendar. If the tribulation were not shortened, then no flesh would be saved. That's in Matthew 24:22. All right, that is it.